welcome everybody to the next panel. If I can take your program here. Is it too early to say kalispera?
No, that's
kalispera.
fine.
Kalimera, kalispera.
That's totally kalispera.
I never get to practice my kalisperas as much as kalimeras, so here we go. Okay, so what we have here is a panel, really three exciting presentations by four people, and it's called Networks of Trade, Knowledge and Practice. And the first speakers are, I like to call her Admiral Charlaftis, okay, and then her trusty Kapitan Galani. Professor Admiral Charlaftis is now based in Crete, and she's the director of the Institute for Mediterranean Studies of the Foundation of Research and Technology, ELAS. And Professor Galani has a PhD in economic history, and we'll forgive her for that, right? That's okay. From the University of Oxford, and is currently a postdoctoral researcher at the National Hellenic Research Foundation. And their presentation is titled The Transnational Entrepreneurial Networks of the Greeks, the Shipping Fleet and the Loans of Independence from Great Britain.
Mm-hmm. We need to see it on the screen, though.
Yep.
Okay.
All right, there it is. Okay. So, καλησπέρα σε όλους. Να ευχαριστήσω πολύ για την πρόσκληση, για την οργάνωση, τη φιλοξενία και την εξαιρετική παρέα εδώ. Professor Varouxakis yesterday mentioned that the Pratt referred to the Greeks as civilized because of trade and shipping. And about this Greek civilization, we are going to talk to you. And we're probably the only paper that will discuss some other roots of Philhellenism, that is, economic interests. So the aim... what do I do here? It doesn't... Oh, there it is. So, back. Front. Great. The aim of our paper is to bring out the British direct and indirect involvement in the Greek War of Independence by signaling out a path dependence that was impeded primarily in economic incentives. Anglo-Greek relations were established and consolidated primarily through the mediation of merchants. Since the early 19th century, Greek traders acted as agents and partners for British firms, both in the Levantine market as well as in the Black Sea. And Greek commercial houses had already settled in London, such as the Raleigh brothers or the Kondostavlos, to carry out their trade westwards. We argue that these economic relations differentiated in practice British stance towards the Greek Revolution in comparison to other European powers. Either by tolerating or actively supporting the Greek case, Britain in fact safeguarded its economic and political interests in the Eastern Mediterranean. Greek-British relations have deep roots. British trade was carried to the Ottoman Empire under the auspices of the Chartered Levant Company. However, during the Napoleonic Wars, in order to overcome the disruption of trade routes, the Greeks acted as British brokers in the East, trading the same favorable terms as the members of the company. The Ionian Islands were under British protection since 1815. In 1822, they declared neutrality towards the belligerents. In practice, however, during the years of the Revolution, the Ionians would systematically turn to the continental coasts as well as the islands and ports of the Aegean, supporting the Greek Revolution economically, politically, militarily. Most important, they acted as a gateway to Western Europe, and especially Britain, from where provisions, ammunitions, and money was channeled to the revolted areas. In 1823, when George Canning stepped to the office of foreign minister, Britain was the first of the European powers to recognize the Greeks as a warring nation with the right to impose naval blockades. This declaration diversified the European front and set the stage for the rivalry among the great powers that lead to the political solution. Political support went hand in hand with military results, as the Treaty of London and the Battle of Navarino sealed the Greek cause. The general assumption that Britain would intervene to save the Greeks is expressed in the plea for protection of 1825 that was signed by prominent Greek warlords and politicians. Nevertheless, the plea was not accepted from the British side to keep up appearances. Last but not least, the issue of loans from the City of London was crucial for the survival of the revolution. Well, we're going to talk, the first part of our presentation, we're going to talk about the commercial and maritime networks of the Greeks as Ottoman and Ionian subjects, with Great Britain long before the Greek Revolution and the wave of Philhellenism took off in the 1820s. And the second part is on the Greek commercial and maritime networks and the loans of independence from Great Britain. Now, we're not talking about the formation of entrepreneurial networks generally or vaguely. We have documented them. And that was a wonderful research project we carried out, and on 20 archives where the dots are, from Taganrog in Odessa and Istanbul up to London, Amsterdam, and Lisbon, and Barcelona. Which is not there. So it's more archives where research took place, and we formed a database called Amphitrite of 15,000 voyages of Ottoman and Venetian Ionian Greek captains from 1700s to 1821. The bulk, of course, is after 1850s, but still, even the first half of the 18th century. This documented the very heavy traffic of Greek, Ottoman Greek ships and Ionian Venetian ships, Venetian and then Ionian ships that carried out the trade of the Mediterranean from the Levant and Black Sea to central Mediterranean, to Western Mediterranean, and even to the Atlantic and to the North Sea. The dots that you see, we did not put them by chance. They're all with GIS, and it's all measured by the number of voyages that took place. And of course, not only the Mediterranean, as you see, they traveled to the Iberian Peninsula, because when they carried, it's all grain, okay? It's all grain from the Aegean, from the coasts of the Aegean and the hinterlands, and in the late 18th century, beginning of 19th century, from Russia, okay? And it is all going to the west, and the ships that arrived in Genova that brought grain to Livorno or Genova or to other Italian ports, they moved to the western Mediterranean and carried the trade of the Spaniards on the Iberian coast, and of the Spaniards, because they had the neutral Ottoman flag, through the Atlantic Ocean, and we find them in Montevideo, even in Providence and the Caribbean, and of course up in the North Sea in Amsterdam, Rotterdam, and so on. And we see a fleet, and by working with the statistics and the voyages and where they come from and everything, we found out that there's a fleet that is growing, and is not in Hydra, Spetses, and Psara. There are another 37 islands, okay, Aegean and Ionian seas. And I am not talking about small vessels. These are vessels, long-distance vessels between Eastern Mediterranean and the rest of the seas that I talked about. So they were right. When we first actually read them with my colleague, Sophia Lai, we thought they were just, the Greeks just, exaggerating. But no. They were right, you know. They said our ships do not only work in the White Sea, but in all seas of the Levante and Ponente and beyond the straits, in the ocean, in the America, in Holland, in England, in the Baltic Sea. And last year, merchants asked for our ships to be chartered for India. I think it's West Indies, but I would like to think that they were also for India. We found actually Ottomans trading the Indian Ocean in the 1770s. So on the eve of the of the revolution, Ottoman and Ionian Greeks from 40 islands and coastal towns owned about 1,000 large merchant vessels of 120,000 tons, fully equipped and carrying 5,670 cannons. The Ottoman archives give in complete detail what every ship had, because we have worked as well, we have combined archives, as you saw, from Istanbul, from the Western Mediterranean archives, the Sanita. So we know exactly as well from the Ottoman archives the equipment, and about 17,000 seamen. Okay, so in 1821, more than 25 maritime Aegean islands and coastal towns revolted, owning 700 large merchant vessels. And these that revolted were the Sultan's seafarers, because it was the Ottoman Greeks that carried the Ottoman Empire's internal and external trade and manned the imperial fleet. Hence the great problems in the Ottoman imperial fleet to function for the first 3 years of the revolution. But let's go back before the revolution again. So by answering to Professor Economou's question in the last session, the percentages indicate the movement of hundreds, thousands of Ionians and also Aegean merchants and ship owners that went to the new cities of Odessa. Odessa was formed in 1794, and Taganrog, which was called in the 19th century the Kingdom of Greeks, because mainly were Greek merchants there. And the percentages are derived from local Russian archives, and it's 55% Ionians in these two towns. So we have large merchants now. So we have already from the previous, from before the end of 18th century, we have Greek merchants connected with the Levant Company. You see the names there. It is Katerina's work that she found out in London. And then we found out as well in the Black Sea Project that since 1813 there were the Hiots there, Petrokokinos, Karamanga, Galati, Rali, Rodokanaki. So, and it is grain. It is very, as it is today, so important. And it was going to the industrializing Western Europe. So Greeks there, we see also from the Russian archives that in the Black Sea port cities, 55% of all merchants that are involved in the external trade, mainly grain trade, are Greeks. And in 1829, almost 70%. And we see their importance in the whole of the Russian Empire. Okay? And that continued to develop. And then on the other side, because this is where the grain is produced, and then it was carried by Greek merchants that bought it, Greek merchants that loaded it to Greek vessels, Ottoman Greek vessels, Ionian Greek vessels, and it was carried to the Western Mediterranean or to Northern Europe. So also from Katerina's research here is we see that in 1820 there are already 6, and then 8, and then multiplying merchant houses in London. And, of course, so many Greeks, it's suspicious. So the Bank of England gives attention. And so Greeks were holding accounts in the bank that represented 2/3 of the entire Greek population situated in London. And in the archives of the Bank of England, there's a special ledger designated Greek firms, It seems that the bank was monitoring par excellence the activity of the Greeks, as their dynamic emergence within a very short time, followed by the circulation of large amounts, had attracted the attention of the banking institutions. So it was the Russian grain and the Greek ships that brought them to London.
Now, during the time of the Greek Revolution,
Next, okay.
I think it's open, yes. Undoubtedly, the loans of independence is the most tangible support offered to the Greek cause. The need for foreign borrowing after domestic resources had been exhausted leads the provisional government to a series of exploratory expeditions throughout the Mediterranean and the Western countries. We know that approaches were made to Spain, Portugal, France, the Knights of Malta, but they were fruitless. And the truth is that England was the most suitable market for many reasons. So why Britain? The first and foremost was that the city had emerged as an international money market where many banking houses operated. From the beginning of the 19th century, from the Napoleonic Wars onwards, there is a specialization in the issue of government loans, that is, loans to government in need of money, such as Russia or Prussia. And at the same time, there is also a new wave of countries seeking credit. These are the countries of Latin America that had revolted pretty much at the same time in the early 20s. So the British money market had acquired an experience of such precarious loans. The British Philhellenes, and especially the Greek Committee, were instrumental in the issue of loans as they practically introduced the Greek delegates to the banking houses and endorsed their claim. Finally, political liberalism that flourished in England was intuitively more receptive to revolutionary movements in contrast to the more reactionary policies pursued by other countries such as Austria or Russia. The loans were issued in 2 consecutive years, and you can see here all the particulars that I will not bore you with. They were drawn from respectable houses, banking houses, with an interest rate that was pretty much the standard for the relevant cases. And this is a further indication that the Greek case was not considered more hazardous than others at the same time. The loans issued bonds, and the Philhellenes were mobilized to make sure that these bonds would circulate in the market, both in Britain but also in the Ionian Islands, to raise as much money as possible. A lot has been said about the burdensome terms of the loans and the poor, if not reprehensible, management of behalf of the Greek delegates, and there were severe reductions in the nominal value of the loans in comparison to the money that were actually brought to the Greek hands. But let's not forget also that Louriotis and Orlandos were brought to court to give their explanation about their behavior and how they managed the whole deal. However, foreign borrowing was a truly difficult and complicated enterprise, and as the figure shows, there were very many stakeholders with different agendas. We had the Greek diaspora merchants, the merchant bankers of London, the bondholders, that's the general public, the Philhellenes, the Greek delegation, the Greek provisional government, all at the same time, stakeholders with different political agendas and not more just political agendas. And all this mixture in pretty much unfavorable economic conditions, economic circumstances, in the light of the credit crisis that broke in 1825 in London. Apart from covering the immediate and pressing expenses, it quickly becomes clear that the greatest benefit for the Greek side is the political dimension. When the Greeks were called to navigate the uncharted waters of international borrowing with the assistance of the British Philhellenes, the Hydro Dimitrios Samados, with exceptional foresight, recognizes international borrowing as a means of exerting pressure, diplomatic pressure, on the European powers. Take as many millions as possible to force them to acknowledge us. And it is shocking that the international money market lends to a state which does not exist. It lends money to a provisional government, which is at the time in civil war, and it lends money to a war effort that marks a turning point with defeats, and it lends money using as a mortgage national lands in a territory that has no clear borders. So it is almost beautifully schizophrenic. However, the issue of the loans seals the fate of Greece and irrevocably binds the British to the Greek cause. Although Canning tried to reassure the Ottomans that the loans were a private business of city bankers and did not mirror an official policy, this could not be true. From now on, Britain has a given economic benefit from the creation of a viable and economically stable Greek state. What has not been sufficiently emphasized so far in relation to the loans is that they are directly related to the war at sea. And this development must be attributed to the government of Koudouriotis, who was in power in 1824-1825. The politician from Hydra fully understood, on the one hand, how crucial war at sea was to gain the independence, and on the other hand, the great cost of naval operations that had drained the island so far. Therefore, Koudouriotis actively promoted the formation of the first official national navy. Money was invested in new warships, such as the ones you see on the picture on the screen, the frigate Hellas, and the steam-powered Carteria Perseverance brought to Greece by Hastings. These ships were built in New York according to the latest, and that is very important, the latest and more ambitious technological specifications. Finally, the incoming money covered the expenses for the mobilization of the fleet, that is wages, provisions, ammunition, for almost 2 years. In effect, as we can see from the detailed distribution of the second loan, 1/4 of the money went to the order of 4 new vessels, while also part of the loan was directed to the fee of Lord Cochrane to assume his position as admiral. The appointment of Cochrane was set as a precondition by the creditors, as they believed that the presence of British officers on land and at sea would improve the war organization of the Greeks and lead to their prevalence. As we can see from the figure here that represents another 1/4 of the incoming loan, it becomes evident that Hydra and Spetses, followed by Psara, absorbed an immense proportion of the foreign loans in the form of wages and provisions, and it is shown in the distribution of the public expenses for 1824-1825 that they actually rocketed. The contribution of the Philhellenes in the creation of the Greek navy is further manifested in their cooperation with Lord Cochrane in order to assist him in his upcoming task. As the Swiss banker Eynard phrased it, "I'm writing to you to facilitate your operations and learn about your plans to save Greece." In a series of letters that are part of the unpublished Greek archive of Lord Cochrane, which is currently being digitized by Laskaridis Foundation, Cochrane had a dense correspondence with the Greek committees of Paris and Marseille, as well as with Eynard in 1826, that is prior to his arrival and placement in Greece. From these letters, it becomes evident that the Philhellenes give a detailed account of the progress of their actions, keeping Cochrane informed on the latest news, such as the cost for the purchase and manning of the warships. I'm sure you can see them. It says sold of a ship, and then you can see the amount of money written next to the ship. These accounts can be fairly detailed, as, for example, he is informed by Prasakakis in Marseille of the trials of the steam engines. I quote, "The valve being out of order and allowed large quantities of steam to escape. The steam engine was ordered by Galloway, who was thought to be over-optimistic and should be treated cautiously." To conclude, politics and economics are intertwined in the Anglo-Greek relations. Britain, first among the European great nations, acknowledged the Greeks as a belligerent nation and offered directly or indirectly support. In contrast to other contemporary revolutions, and we talked yesterday about the Balkans, that were frowned upon by the European status quo, the role of the Greeks in the Mediterranean as trading partners and providers of maritime transport to the Ottoman Empire since the 18th century differentiated Britain's stance towards the Greek Revolution. The restoration of peace in the Eastern Mediterranean, the restoration of commercial and maritime activity, the smooth operation of trade networks, and the reconnection of the European markets with the Levant were major factors in shaping British policy in the region. Furthermore, the greatest naval power of the time seemed to have an innate affinity to the Greeks, seafarers and economic agents in the Levant, and hence offered active support to the Greek cause. This support, be it political, financial, or military, was in effect channeled through the Philhellenic networks. Thank you.
Thank you very much. What a model of collaboration. Just a terrific report. So our next speaker is Athanasios Barlagyannis. He has recently been elected to the Academy of Athens as an associate researcher. So congratulations to him. He studied at the École des Hautes Études en Sciences Sociales in Paris, and his PhD is on the history of Greek public health during the first half of the 19th century. His second book is on the medical history of the Revolution, and it is published in 2022 by the Hellenic Open University Press. Thanasi, the word is yours.
Thank you very much. I would like to thank Michalis Sotiropoulos for the invitation and congratulate him for his organizing capacities. So I'm going to talk about two Philhellenes. The one, Étienne-Marin Bailly, was French. The other, Samuel Gridley Howe, was American. Of the same generation, Bailly was born in 1795 and Howe in 1801. They were both physicians, active Philhellenes, and I mean by that they occupied military and medical posts during the Revolution of 1821. And they were also socially and politically active in their own respective countries, proposing medical reforms. While Bailly was already an accepted member of European scientific and political societies when he arrived in 1825 in revolutionary Nafplion, Howe, on the contrary, started his career in 1824 with his support on American Philhellenism and his arrival in Greece. Their divergences were not, however, limited to that. I will discuss their political and scientific differences, while at the same time I will try to situate them inside a large medical reformation movement that I think was taking place in the Ottoman Empire since the 18th century, of which movement the medical history of the Greek Revolution was one successful episode. Bailly and Howe didn't propose two opposite stances in the face of disease and public health governance, but two different and under certain circumstances complementary tendencies inside the medical Philhellenism. It's a notion that I use for this lecture, for this talk. Medical Philhellenism was not introducing medical and political innovations in the regions under revolt, but I think it was incorporating in a Western-type public health governance the medical developments and dynamics of the Ottoman Empire that the Greek Revolution was reinforcing. So, I will start with Bailly. Bailly studied medicine in Paris and offered his services to Napoleon in the Battle of Meaux in 1814. He became acquainted with physician Franz Joseph Gall and his phrenology doctrine. While phrenology is now considered as a pseudoscience, at the end of the 18th century, it was at the medical avant-garde of clinical and physiological observation, along with homeopathy and magnetism, two medical doctrines that have had their followers among Christian physicians in the Ottoman Empire. Expressing radical medical researches in the context of the French Revolution, when clinical medicine was born, phrenology was linked to Saint-Simon's radical liberalism. Gall, as well as Bailly, were present to the last hours of the dying Saint-Simon. Bailly served actually as his secretary, while he composed the medical part of Saint-Simon's Opinion littéraire, philosophique et industrielle of 1825. Phrenology gained massive support among politicians, philanthropists, moralists, and physicians that were anxious to get rid of the ancient and obsolete political as well as medical establishment of the university professors and the French Académie de Médecine. Phrenology was a school for radical thought and action, attracting young people like Bailly because it was thought of giving them the science, and I quote, that teaches why and how humans act upon their environment. End of quotation. In his chapter, De la physiologie appliquée à l'amélioration des institutions sociales, that means on the physiology applied for the betterment of social institutions, Bailly was proposing social and moral reforms on the basis of the organic metaphor that was particularly attracting to all revolutionary medical doctrines like homeopathy, which meant that the human body interferes with the cosmos, the universe. Following Saint-Simon, who thought that there was a continuum between the organic life and inorganic material, and thus between the natural sciences, like astronomy, and religion, as well as moral, political, and medical sciences, Bailly, like other clinicians, physiologists, and experimentalists of this age of the prophets, to quote Benichou, was confident that his medical knowledge on human physiology could be useful to politicians, legislators, and moralists. And for that matter, in 1825, Bailly had the opportunity to put his medical and philosophical expertise to the service of the Greek revolutionary authorities as an agent of the Paris Committee. Bailly arrived at with the order to propose economic measures and to establish a hospital. In that, he collaborated with the revolutionary administration, which 1 month later after his arrival, in October 1825, promulgated the law on the establishment of hospitals in Greece. Paragraph 4 of the law attested the need for an ordinance which would apply the general legislative prescriptions and arrange the details of the hospital's function. Bailly was chosen by the executive for that work, that means to write the ordinance. The result was the Ministère Général de Santé en Grèce, General Ministry of Health in Greece. Bailly's proposal was, however, more ambitious than the establishment of a hospital, as he himself acknowledged in his letters to the Paris Committee. Bailly's text was regulating diverse public health aspects, such as medical statistics, military medicine, the creation of a medical faculty, border health offices, and professional organization. In a word, Bailly wanted to establish a Ministry of Health, with him as the powerful director, about 100 years before the first ministries were ever established in Europe. For example, the French Ministry of Health was created in 1920, and in Greece, the first Ministry of Health was created between 1917 and 1922. Of course, people of the period knew already that, and I quote, the application, that means of the General Ministry of Health, seems difficult, except for the details that concern the establishment of the hospital. End of quotation. In other words, Bailly's proposal was adapted to the actual circumstances by the military and political agents of the revolution. Moreover, a close study to the medical history of the revolutionary period shows that Bailly's proposals weren't totally new. Hospitals were already at work since 1821, when, for example, the local authorities of Missolonghi, backed by Stanhope's money, established a dispensary, while discussions for a hospital controlled by the administration began in 1822. Bailly's plan introduced, however, one novelty: public health centralization. He was aspiring that the hospitals of Nafplion, there were 3, one military, one for the poor, and one for foreign troops. The hospitals in Nafplion were unified into one and put under the one administration, which wanted to legitimize its control over all other hospitals of the region, erected since then, and at the same time to control the revolution itself. After having contributed to the hospital organization, Bailly moved on to the economic administration. By 1825, he participated in a 3-person committee that was managing Philhellenism money for the army's needs. And now I go to Howe. At about the same time, December 1824, another physician, like many others for that matter, came in the Peloponnese from the US. Howe had just finished his studies in Harvard University when he started working as a surgeon on Greek battleships. He became, in 1825, Chief Medical Inspector of the Navy. Beyond his service in field surgery, Howe introduced with his practice a logic of governance that was innovative and for that reason rested marginal and was hardly accepted by the revolutionary authorities. From his military posts and from his private clientele, Howe got acquainted with most of the famous Proisti and Armatoloi of his time. He spoke French and Italian. He learned seemingly well Greek and Ottoman Turkish. His inclination to learn from his experience was significant of his attitude towards the natives, as exemplified by the fustanella he started to wear. His management capacities, his respect to local customs, and his spirit-mindedness made him ideal for the work that the Boston Committee chose him for, to manage the money sent for the relief of the war victims. As a dissident, and probably a Quaker, I don't know, his main objective was to address the consequences of war, not to help perpetuate fighting it. In this, he has had many conflicts with eminent military leaders like Kolokotronis, who couldn't understand why the Americans wouldn't support the army when it was its gains in the battlefield that were offering protection to the agricultural production and to the lives of the orphans and the poor families. An incident is testified. Howe had the courage, or probably the innocence, to put himself between an angry group of army men and a warehouse with foodstuff for the poor. In general, Howe's approach was a combination of strictness and the capacity of negotiation in order to advance his cause. In fact, he apparently knew very well the native psychology and the power relations of the time, which he could very well balance. He was very close to the needs of the poor and knew how to satisfy them, as exemplified by the following case. In order for the representatives of the Boston Committee to distribute the aid to poor families of Nafplion, Howe proposed that lists of 10 families should be dressed up. Each list was verified by a local priest and by Howe himself, who went door to door to examine the economic state of each family. Then, a representative was chosen from each list. He was to obtain, or she, I don't know, was to obtain the necessary food for the families of his list from the American warehouses. In that way, Howe wanted to avoid women and children to be stepped on to death by the hungry crowds, seemingly something which apparently had occurred previously. His poor relief politics had two novel characteristics, and I mean novel in respect to local practices. First, his philanthropy was connected to employment project and to work ethics. In April 1821, Kapodistrias offered Howe, during his second travel to Greece, a large piece of land next to Corinth. There, the physician organized a colony of women and children where they could find security and a land to cultivate. The notion of the useful poor was adopted by Kapodistrias also, when he demanded, for example, that the poor of Nafplion should earn their bread by cleaning up the streets of the town. However, during the revolution, when the poor and the destitute were considered to be confronting the consequences of a patriotic war, and thus they had earned political and social rights, this mentality of work ethics rested marginal. The poor didn't have to work to prove their worth. They were worthy because they suffered for the sake of their country's liberty. The second novelty that the American Philhellenism reinforced was medical charity. All the hospitals during the Revolution, and also all Greek hospitals after 1833 and until about the 1880s, were state-sponsored, or they functioned thanks to some sort of a central or would-be central finance. On the contrary, the Boston Committee's logic was for a decentralized individual funding. Howe organized a hospital for the poor on the island of Poros. It was a philanthropic institution, the only one during the Revolution under private and not public or collective control. American aid was a sort of a humanitarian aid, largely motivated by the special movement of doctors of fortune like Howe and of evangelical missionaries that started to appear in the Ottoman Empire since the beginning of the 19th century. After Poros, Howe returned to the USA, where he was actively engaged in raising money for the revolutionaries and in ensuring an education for orphans of the revolution. He also engaged himself in the funding of the Polish resistance to the Russians. He even got imprisoned in Berlin, and in abolitionism and the anti-slavery movement. I found that in 1863, for example, he was appointed member of the American Freedmen's Inquiry Commission. Furthermore, as a fervent Republican, Howe participated in the Paris July Revolution while he was pursuing his medical studies. Finally, Howe was the founder and the first director of the Perkins Institution for the Education of the Blind. To conclude, There are many common features as well as differences between these two agents of medical Philhellenism understudy. Inventive, innovative, proposing advanced for their time ideas and practices, Bailly and Howe represent their countries of origin. Bailly, from continental Europe, had a more formal or official approach, proposing a state-centered or centralized reform plans. His plans had the ambition to foresee in advance every public health aspect, even if they progressively became an object of negotiation when applied to concrete social conditions. On the other hand, we can say that Howe probably represents an Anglo-Saxon liberal tradition with a more interpersonal or informal approach on public health matters. Individual motivation and mobilization, work ethics, philanthropy, and continuous surveillance stood behind every aspect of his activities, which had also to be negotiated in the face of powerful pressures and resistances. Then Howe could give off, for example, food and money to the troops when he couldn't get away with it. Even though their point of departure was different, the two met in the middle when they had to negotiate with the local authorities. They were both proposing politics of hospital care, of statistical knowledge. Let us remind that Howe dressed up lists with poor families, so that's knowledge, and of public health governance in a period just when Greek health politics were being organized by former Ottoman technocrats, politicians, military men, and physicians. Their medical Philhellenism fell within global health transformations in the region. For example, in the same year of 1825, when Bailly left Paris, another French physician departed from Marseille to Egypt. Antoine Barthélemy Claude Bey was assigned to aid in the medical organization of Muhammad Ali's troops, the troops that fought in the Peloponnese against the Greeks, and the troops that fought in Syria in 1831 against the Sultan's armies, who were under the leadership of the same Kütahi Pasha who previously had fought against the 1821 revolution. I found in a paper that I read on Ottoman military hospital that this defeat of the Ottoman troops in Syria accelerated the Tanzimat reforms of the Ottoman Empire. So if we consider that some years before, at the end of the 18th century, the beginning of the 19th century, Ali Pasha, in the regions of Epirus and Thessaly, just a little to the north of the regions that where the revolution had succeeded. Ali Pasha also applied medical regulations, established hospitals and lazarettos, and paid for community physicians. Then we should consider that Bailly's and Howe's medical discourses and practices were shared by many of the revolution's physicians and administrators, like physician John Coletis, who had worked for Ali Pasha then and who collaborated with Bailly afterwards as Minister of War. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. May I call it inventive, innovative, and advanced in terms of your research? Really original stuff. It's terrific to hear. So our third paper is by Christos Aliprantis. Is he with us? He's an adjunct professor in social sciences at the American College of Thessaloniki and a postdoctoral researcher at Ruhr University in Bochum, Germany. He earned his PhD in modern European history from the University of Cambridge in 2020, and since then he has also held postdoctoral positions at the European University Institute in Florence and Ludwig Maximilian University in München, right, as my friends like to say. His research interests focus on the history of state formation, policing, migration, and nationalism in 19th and 20th century Europe. The title of the paper for today is O Φιλελληνισμός και η απαρχέστης διακρατικής αστυνόμευσης στην κεντρική Ευρώπη 1821 μέχρι 1830. And Christos.
Yes.
Welcome,
much,
Christos.
Lucia,
it's all you. Okay.
Thank you very much, Lucia, for your kind introduction. I hope you can all listen to me and see me well. Yeah. And we encounter no technical issues. Having said that, I regret for not being able to be with you in Athens, but my teaching responsibilities in Thessaloniki have kept me away. Apologies for that, Michael. So allow me to fully share my screen. Lovely. Right. So far, we have heard quite a lot about Britain and the role of the British in the Greek Revolution, something about also France, at least one Frenchman and one American, while we have Lucien among us, who of course is an expert on Russia. At this point, I would like to bring a fourth great power in the game at play, that is most notably the Habsburg Empire, and focus more on Central European policing, above all, policing exercised by Austria, by the Habsburg Empire, vis-à-vis the Philhellenes, and to a certain extent the Greeks, most notably during the 1820s. Before doing that and following the tradition that Professor Charlαύτη and Dr. Ghalani have established, I'd like to deal a little bit with pre-revolutionary policing, especially policing of the Greeks during the revolutionary and Napoleonic periods. Afterwards, I will focus slightly a little bit on the new European order of 1815 and the problem of security that rose at this particular time. And then I will fully proceed to the 1820s and examine Philhellenism as a security issue, then afterwards elaborating further on policing the Philhellenes in both land and sea, though, as we'll examine. Dealing with the world around 1800, that is, in the first decades of the French Revolution, we should first and foremost remark that most European states had started to establish their own policing institutions since at least the mid of the 17th century. France under Louis XIV, and later on, the Habsburg Empire under Maria Theresa and Joseph II have started to establish their own police directories in their capital cities, such as Paris and Vienna, in order, among others, to police political dissidents in their territories. Policing acquired a new meaning after the outbreak of the French Revolution, when challenges against the established status quo became at least seemingly higher and more intense. As we know from our own national historiography, the spread of radical ideas across Central and Southeastern Europe was considered to be quite a challenge in the late 18th century. Large amounts of ink have been said about Rigas Ferreos of Ernest Lys and how he, so to speak, evangelized new and progressive ideas for the rapid, rigid, actually drastic reorganization of the Balkans. What is less known, though, as I plan to show, is exactly state responses vis-à-vis such incidences, and the fact that Rigas' arrest and later execution by 1798 was nothing but one episode out of a chain of state police reaction against what was considered to be a much larger wave of dissidents, of challenge against the established political and social status quo. So throughout the 1790s, and at least since 1793, the Greek Orthodox populations of the major Austrian cities, such as Vienna and Trieste, were systematically surveilled by the Austrian police authorities at the time. Surveillance that continued well after Rigas' arrest and at least until 1815. Measures implemented against those Greek speakers, Greek Orthodox, included, but were not limited, at letter opening, and that is systematic mail interference, censorship, and spying, both public and private, most often by police informers, denunciators, and of course, formal police officials. Even if arrests, straight arrests, were a relatively rare phenomenon On the other hand, border controls and banishments or extradition of those deemed as dangerous was a more common administrative practice. Not only Rigas, but other among his associates, such as Georgios Theocharis, Georg Theochari, among the Austrian documents, were frequently, more often than not, arrested and sent away, most notably in the Ottoman territories or in the rest of the German states. And here we can see how some of Riga's persecuted documents look like. An initial report of the Triestine police on the left, and a document from the Vienna police directory responding to the original Triestine documents on the right. It is important to mention, of course, that the Austrian police did not exclusively police the Greeks. The Greek Orthodox populations did not have this exclusive privilege, so to speak, but as I'm arguing here, the policing of the Greeks can function as a lens through which we can understand, we can comprehend the wider policing and spy mechanisms during the revolutionary and the restoration periods. That condition applies especially for the post-1815 setting. As recent historians of security, such as Beatrice de Graaf, have outlined, a major concerns of the European policymakers in 1815 was to establish a solid, a resilient security order, a security culture even across Europe that would be able first to prevent another major pan-European conflict, and second, to suppress revolutions from below, so to speak, that could in turn lead to such a pan-European conflict. In the police, a more broadly conservative vocabulary of the time, terms such as Democrats, Jacobins, Bonapartists, the Party of Riots, the so-called Umsturzpartei, parade recurrently in state documents. It isn't very much relevant, and it really cannot be proven whether all these conditions applied really or whether the police simply exaggerated towards such claims. What is indisputable, though, is that these recurrent depictions of events, these recurrent re-emerging depictions of reality, created, so to speak, a new reality on itself in the eyes of the police authorities, which in turn triggered and legitimized measures of coercion and suppression, which of course came to be very real. Scholars such as Maurizio Isabella, I believe I saw him earlier in the audience, has of course spoken, and you are very much aware of that, of a liberal international among the Mediterranean revolutions of the time. It is also, though, noteworthy to mention that against this liberal international, states and bureaucrats of the time had their own instruments and tools. Metternich and his own associates, such as the head of the Vienna police, Count Joseph von Sedlinsky, were aware of at least some kind of links between the various revolutionary groups at the time and wanted very much to try at least surveil and contain these links. The Greek Revolution, as being a quite long-standing uprising, don't forget it lasted for almost a decade, fed quite widespread fears of turmoil in the eyes of conservative powers of the time, especially when it comes to Austria, since the Balkans were the soft belly, so to speak, of the Habsburg Empire in the Mediterranean. In the expression of Metternich himself, in a short memorandum written after the end of his service in 1849, now safely stored in his own private papers in Prague. And I quote in translation, "The uprising of the Greeks was the most important political and social event of my time in power," the former chancellor wrote. So since he had spent about half a century in office, then we can understand the magnitude he addressed to that decade-long revolution. As we all know, this long-term conflict implicated several powers. It's brought inside the wider complications of the Eastern question. And let us not forget that it is one of the very few, if not the only one, revolution in the time of revolutions that brought the support of it against the Ottoman Empire, not its suppression by another great power. Philhellenism on itself, it's a unique phenomenon. We have no Phil-Italianism or Phil-Spanionism, just the armed volunteering for the sake of the Greeks. And all these events, all these developments, as one can understand, cause the severe concerns of the Polish officials across Europe, most notably in the Habsburg Empire, but also in Prussia, the Italian states, France, and so on. Right after the outbreak of the revolt in the Danubian Principalities, let's move here, right after the breaking out of the revolt in the Danubian Principalities in spring of 1821, the Habsburg intelligence and information mechanism was mobilized in order to try and gather as much information as possible regarding local developments. A network based on borderline police informers across the eastmost Habsburg provinces, in Galicia, the Bukovina, and Transylvania, was used in order to bring forward update information, while the Austrian consuls in Bucharest and Iași did the same, mobilizing their own local information networks. The defeated soldiers of Alexander Ypsilanti who tried to, so to speak, escape in the Austrian borders of Transylvania were also stopped. And even if they were allowed in due course to remain on Transylvanian soil, they were strictly, or at least to the extent that was possible, monitored by the local authorities for many years to come. Even Alexander Ypsilanti's brother, Demetrius, who fled across Austria to Greece in later 1821, as we can attest from the various marks on his passports, was quite frequently stopped by the Austrian authorities, who tried, unsuccessfully though, in that case, to exercise control over who moved in their lands. Port cities, especially, fervent spots of mobility of goods, people, and ideas, such as Venice and Trieste, were places of intense police activity. The Venetian and Triestine police was quite active in interfering with correspondence of leading Greek-speaking, Greek Orthodox intellectuals and other supporters of the Greek cause, including Andrea Mustoxidi, Lord Byron, Capodistria, and others. It is not uncommon, it is not unexpected, what I found in both the Venetian and the Viennese archives, that Mustoxidi, Byron, and Capodistria are names and their letters who come up again and again in the police reports of the time. Not only in the Habsburg lands, though, but elsewhere in Germany. Let me go slightly back, right. Okay, across the German states now, police reactions were substantial. It is important to remember that most, at least the majority, of the armed volunteers that went to Greece were of German descent. So Germans were the largest group among those who managed to travel and fight to Greece. That was no accident, because a couple of years before the outbreak of the Greek Revolution, the German states faced a severe repressive and censorship regime, epitomized in the so-called Karlsbad decrees of 1819, which imposed severe censorship, especially among German universities. Next to that, a federal investigative commission were set up in Frankfurt to oversee political activities across the Bund, across the German Confederation, leaving German intellectuals with apparently a limited number of alternatives if they wanted to express politically. Supporting the Greek cause, though, in the 1820s, appeared a fine way for them to demonstrate, so to speak, their liberal political beliefs in a clever and indirect way. Despite appearances, though, the authorities were not, as you can see, that willing to allow this sort of political expression. The Philhellenes, the volunteers that wished to travel across the German state and the Italian territories to reach Greece were not, as you can understand, that welcome from local authorities. The authorities, the police, was alarmed in many settings, the Prussian, the Bavarian, the Austrian police, and so on, for a number of reasons. The threat to the sovereignty of legitimate monarchs, the threat for the integrity of the German Confederation, quite a few Philhellenes being deserters from their state armies, and eventually potential acts of hostility against the formally friendly Ottoman Empire were just the most important reasons why the Philhellenes were considered a threat. A threat triggering appropriate measures, such as the confiscation of Friedrich Thiers' correspondence, Thiers being a quite well-known professor at Munich University and a fervent advocate of the Philhellenic cause, of course, censorship among notable pro-Greek papers, such as the Augsburger Allgemeine Zeitung, censorship of other intellectuals and policing supporting the Greek cause, such as Wilhelm Krug in Saxony, and most notably, the exchange of information regarding Philhellenes between various states, Austria, Prussia, Saxony, and so on. And last but not least, the banning, time and again, of Philhellenic associations in Prussia and Austria, a measure that rather attests to the inability of the authorities to definitely put down the Philhellenic phenomenon, rather their capacity to do so. Finally, and to be absolutely frank, I didn't aim to do that in advance, but I always wish to be in accordance, in agreement with my fellow co-panelists. Therefore, as a tribute to Professor Charlαύτη and Dr. Ghalani, I decided to include at least a small section on, so to speak, policing coastal areas and of the seas, in order to prevent my paper suffering from maritime blindness, from thalassini typhlosi. I hope to avoid that error. We should not, of course, disregard the phenomenon that not only in the interior of these states policing was exercised. Across borders, abroad, there were extensive consular networks as well. The Habsburg consular network was established and well linked in the Ottoman and the belligerent territories, Greek territories as well. Next to that, throughout the 1820s, we can also observe the increased Austrian naval presence across the Aegean. Olga Kassiardi-Hering and Dimitris Kotogyorgis are currently preparing a superb monograph, from what I hear, on the Austrian Armada in the belligerent Aegean. I don't want to enter the territories. It's enough for me to mention that both consuls and the Austrian fleet, the Austrian sailors, exercised at least a kind of policing, one could speak, could argue. And with that, I mean especially the measures against piracy, to the extent that piracy was linked to political crime. More than once, to be frank, quite frequently, I have encountered Greek pirates being associated with being rebels, Carbonari, and so on and so forth. I believe, and I'm arguing, that to the extent that these people were associated to political crime, measures against them can be included to the broad category of political policing. Although this once again, makes policing an ambiguous form with unclear meanings. And not only, of course, in the 1820s, but afterwards, throughout the 19th century, this sort of peculiar policing or semi-policing, how to put it, was extended in organizations, in institutions, seemingly indifferent to policing, such as the Maritime Company of Austrian Lloyd, that surveilled its passengers' contact data, its passengers' detail, to search for potentially dangerous individuals. Perhaps we could mention more about that during the discussion. For now, though, it is enough to sum up and first and foremost clarify and point out, highlight that Philhellenism, in my opinion, can function as a useful lens to understand the wider European police policies in the periods after the Congress of Vienna. Through Philhellenism, we can grasp, we can understand the rather excessive fears of states and political and social elites, which nonetheless gave rise to very real policing measures and methods, which included, just to summarize the most important measures here, surveillance of post, of the press and censorship, a passport system that aimed, to an extent unsuccessfully, to monitor human mobility, police informers that became more and more during the Restoration period, and denunciation, which betrayed a substantial core of support for the established social order after 1815, and last but not least, banishments and extradictions. Let us also not exaggerate, finally, upon the power and authority of the system. The policing system of the time remained very much imperfect. By modern standards, it was severely understaffed, underpaid, and technologically quite primitive, as the chronic concern, as the chronic security anxiety of the time witnesses and demonstrates. And still, despite its imperfections, it forms a part of a wider chain of state development and of the emergence of modern police institutions that have started to rise since the late 18th century and continued throughout the 19th and the 20th century. I would like to stop here and thank you all very much for your attention, while looking forward to your questions and concerns.
Welcome back, everybody. I know it's been a long day, so we're just going to have a brief presentation about our digital Finley that we're very excited about. Yes, you can.
Can I just interrupt Amalia, in order to introduce Amalia? This is Amalia Kakissis. She's the archivist of the British School at Athens. And with Amalia, we have been working for 1 year and a half on the Finlay collection, that part that we're digitizing. And Amalia will talk to you today about that digitization process and the project in general. Thank you.
Okay. So I would first like to start by thanking several of the people behind the making of Digital Finlay, which of course is part of the larger BSA project, the unpublished archives of British Philhellenism during the Greek Revolution of 1821, and the reason we're all here today, and tomorrow as well. First, thanks goes to our BSA chairman and academic advisor of the project, Roddy Beaton, and former BSA director John Bennett for creating this project, which gave center stage to the George Finlay papers, which is one of our largest archive collections within the personal papers of the British School Archives. Also, many thanks to our current director, Rebecca Sweetman, for her continued support as we see this project through to completion. Now, we're especially grateful, of course, to the generous support of the Stavros Niarchos Foundation, without which this project would not have been possible. A big thanks to Felicity Crow, who is somewhere in the audience. Oh, there she is. 1821 Project Archive Assistant, who was with Michalis and I last year for the beginning of the project. She is now archivist of the British Institute of Libyan and North African Studies. To Michalis Sotiropoulos, the 1821 Fellow in Modern Greek Studies at the BSA and principal investigator of the project, for his expert eye, his good humor and disposition, his great conversations about the Finlay papers, which not only were beneficial in processing the new catalog, but I also think benefited both Felicity and I for the historical context of the material we were working with. It has been the first time for me, at least, to work alongside a historian for such a long time while processing an archive collection, and it made a much more fulfilling and educational experience since historians and archivists come to collections in different ways. Thanks to the library staff, Evi Charitoudi, Evgenia Villiotti, and our then library archive intern, Thomas Bull, who is now slated to go to the University of Pennsylvania, and who you will be hearing tomorrow morning, using some of the Finlay material in his presentation. And last but not least, thanks to all the techies behind Digital Finlay and making it available to the public. Varvara Zyambaka at Be Digital for the excellent job digitizing the material, some of which was very fragile. Former BSA data manager Anastasia Vasiliou and current digital assets manager Eleni Gadolu, who is here as well with her family. For expertly commandeering the digital data produced for this project. A special thanks to two former BSA IT officers, Nathan Meyer, for helping convert the printed Finlay catalog into an electronic one that we could work with our new collection management software, as well as Halvard Ingvert for helping code the software for our digital portal, digital collections. And last but not least, to BSA Systems Administrator Yanni Dalezu, for putting the final pieces in place for Digital Finlay to go live, as you see on the screen now. So just a little bit about the archive, which you have more or less probably heard about a little bit. And as some of you know, the George Finlay papers, along with his library, were donated to the BSA in 1899 by his nephew, William Cook, who was the executor of his estate. Now, they came to the BSA almost more than 20 years after George Finlay's death. And these papers included, of course, the papers of Captain Frank Hastings, Greek-American Philhellenes George Jarvis, and some papers of John Finlay, George's father. The Finlay Library, which included, of course, the archives, was absorbed into the BSA library and cataloged within it. And this included, again, the original manuscripts along with his printed books. William Miller was the first to write something about the Finlay collection, so we don't know what it was like as a collection of its own before it came to the BSA. And William Miller wrote about it in the 1920s in a brief article in the BSA. And so it wasn't until Byzantine historian Joan Hussey convinced the BSA Council in the mid-1960s, so again, another 40 years, that precious original archive material should be separated from the library and cataloged. Her printed catalog for the Finley papers was published in 1973. And this was really the only way researchers were able to have access to this collection. So if a researcher didn't already know a little bit about Finley and what he did, or maybe what he wrote about, it was a bit difficult to tap into that collection. So in the remit of our new project, we had to transform Joan Husse's printed catalog into an electronic one, and which should then be migrated into these collection management systems, which are then searchable online. This was done by converting the PDF of the catalog into Word, converting it into OCR, and then running a Python script to export data into Excel sheet, which is the form that it can be uploaded into these management systems. Once it was in Excel, we applied the archival standard description, ISAD-G, to it, so it could be formed like a proper archive collection should be. This, of course, proved quite challenging within certain parts of the collection, as Joan Hussey was inconsistent with her level of description or the organizations of the sections. So over the course of the project, we had tried to find a balance between respecting the published catalog, because it's an entity of itself now, and updating it for the digital era. And in doing so, we have encountered the different approaches archivists and historians can take, and how these have changed over the past half-century. So once archive standards were applied, it was imported into our collection management system, and in addition to standardized archive fields, this system gives us options for additional fields to record metadata to facilitate its use as linked open data and subject thesauri. This is integral to facilitate its use as linked data and its integration into wider projects such as the 1821 Digital Archive. So the launch of Digital Finley this evening is the first phase which we're making public, and I'll show you a little bit how it works in a moment. This includes the entire catalog is online now, and the materials selected for digitization specifically for this current project. So not all of the collection is digitized. And in the second phase of the project will be coming is to enrich the user's experience. So one part of it, of course, is fundraising and getting more digital images up to complete the collection. We will be adding transcriptions of selected material, thanks to Dr. Satiropoulos here. Working with the metadata to link into standardized databases, again, like the 1821 Digital Archive, for subject and keywords, proper names, and sites. And to properly display a finding aid, which for archive collections give you the contextualizes the entire collection, but then all the sections. And additionally, the last part of it, which we hope to do, is work with the sites, and which we'll be able to create maps. I'll show you a small demonstration here tonight, and what we call story maps. So having the George Finley papers digitally accessible now gives us immediate access to researchers, and then now endless possibilities for collaborations. So that's all I have to say. So now I'm just going to show you a little bit how it works. Put my papers down. So this is the front page of our digital collections. Let me do this for you. And Finley is one of our highlighted collections now. So you see him there. So this is what is called the grid view of our collections. So you can see everything that's, again, digitized or not digitized. Just go in there and look at one of the, it's a random pick. So here you see the catalog entry of the collection. And then, sorry, this touchpad is very sensitive. There we go. Oh, no, there we go. I want to do that. The detail and how well they can be read is amazing, actually. So anyway, this is one of the bigger volumes that can be read. So again, a lot of people can just come and read the Finley archives online now, which is quite exciting. This gives a little bit of the history of the collection. Again, the finding aid will become later, which will give you context for the entire collection. We have a very extended bibliography of George Finlay here. Some of them you can link in and actually read them, like our BSA volumes here, like Joan Hussey's. There's actually a direct link that you can actually read the printed article. Hopefully the conference volume will also be part of this list eventually.
Not a very long list for historians.
Just extended another view that you can get in. Anyway, so here again, this is the grid list, the grid view. This is the map view. This is not, I'm just going to point out, this is not the Finlay collection because we have not done this yet. But this is from the Byzantine Research Fund collection that we have, and it just shows the capability of what we can do with the Finlay collection once the sites module is actually set up, and Eleni's great work towards that. Eleni Gadoliou. I'm just going to go back to the search function here, and then I'm just going to put whatever. So the advanced search function here. You pick George Finlay, oops. There we go. I'm just going to do a keyword. Now, this system is set up to search all collections. All fields in the database. So I will put HIOS in, but I could put it in another spelling format and it'll still catch it. There's variations of names in here too. So those are the hits for whatever is listed as HIOS, one of which is not digitized. And this is one of the volumes of Hastings. Oops. Come on, here we go. Sorry, this is very, there we go. So this is one of the bound volumes of Hastings that has various letters in it. You can see that. Some of it has been conserved. And then lastly, I'm just going to go back to the map view. So again, this is somewhat what we're capable of doing now on digital collections, but we also want to do story maps. And this is a sample that Eleni did for us. Oops. Again. Start from the beginning. So it includes the actual archival material to a scenario linked to the map. I'm going to go through this slowly. From Hydra to Chios. And here, let me just go back and show you, this is the logbook of Hastings when he travels to Chios. No.
This is from Themistocles. He's on board the Themistocles of Yakoumaki Dobazis.
And then here he goes to the Gulf of Smyrna. So this is just a brief example, again, what we can do with this sort of data. Thank you for your attention.